Hey, I hope your day's going great. In this new Django REST API tutorial series, you are going to learn about the fundamentals of REST APIs and how to build one using Django. I want to use this episode to really make sure that you understand the basics of how the client and the server interact, because I've seen some questions along the lines of, can Django replace JavaScript, which I really want to clear up, and I think that's still a topic that confuses a lot of beginners, which is why I want to clear up the confusion around that topic. So yeah. When building web applications, we most likely have some sort of database, which of course sits on a server. A server is just a computer which serves, as the name suggests, other computers. Let's say the client was to request a URL under detail 1. The request now goes to our server, where we check if that URL even exists. If that is not the case, we have to return a 404, just to signal that it doesn't. But if it does exist, we return a response, which in the case of Django happens in our view. And then the user gets back some sort of HTML page with embedded CSS and JavaScript to make it look nicer, and then he's hopefully happy. And what we have to understand about this model is that they are independent components which of course have to interact with each other to get data from the database to the client. That's why I drew these arrows, just to make sure that you understand that we have to send requests to the server and then get a response back. And that's generally what happens if we request a page. And that's also why Django can't replace JavaScript, because Django is on the server and JavaScript on the client. And the client is basically just everything that the user can see. If we were to right click on a page, we could click on inspect and of course view the entire source code for our page, like the HTML, CSS and JavaScript. That's why, by the way, you shouldn't have any business logic that you want to hide from the user on the client side. But with the rising of new technologies such as Vue.js, of course, it doesn't happen in the exact same way as it did before, where a server just renders a template and sends it as a response. And therefore we have to be able to somehow get the data from the server to our client to render it on the client instead of on the server. And that's called client-side rendering instead of server-side rendering. Whether we choose client-side or server-side rendering, or a mixture of both, depends on the use case. And now comes our API into play, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And in most cases we use REST APIs to serialize some data from the database and represent it as an object which we can consume. But of course, when working with REST APIs, you don't have to necessarily return some kind of database object that is now serialized. You can also, use Python to do some sort of calculation and get it back to the client side. And there are of course different kinds of requests. That would be for a GET request. But you can of course also post data to the server without expecting some kind of JSON object back. In the case of building a web app, we would now use AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Just that XML is a bit older than JSON, which is why we now use JSON. And JSON is just a modern file format that basically any modern language can understand. I mean, of course the user could still go to the address bar and type in the URL for the API and then still get the JSON object if we haven't actually secured the API. But for him it wouldn't really make sense because he just sees some data, which isn't in any context he would like to view. And that's why we generally use JavaScript in the case of web apps to consume our REST API. And by the way, if you're building some kind of mobile application, you can also send a request to the same URL and then get back the same data. Because as we said, JSON is supported by any modern language. But still, now that we send a request, we of course have to go through a view as well, but only that view doesn't now return a nice HTML template. It just returns a basic JSON object, which we can consume of course, as we just said. And that now enabled us to go from the client to the server and get back some data, for example from the database, which we can now use to, for example, change the user interface in some kind of way. That depends of course on your use case. I hope that you now have a good general understanding of how this works. As always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. In the next part, we're going to jump right into Django and build the REST API and cover topics such as views and routers and serializers and how all of that happens and what it does. I hope to see you inside for the next one, and cheers!